Good day, friends. Good morning, good evening, whatever it is for you. Good. Good. I hope it's good. I am sorry that I didn't get this video lecture discussion thing above up yesterday. I tried to get these by Tuesday, but my Tuesday was very, very busy. And my Wednesday, kind of busy too. But I'm still making sure that we have enough time that we can discuss some things, including, and mostly, the chapters that we read in Method and Madness. So what this video is going to be is me kind of talking us through some of the points that are in the textbook, discussing some things about details and the other stuff that's mentioned in the text, and then you giving me a response. And so we can do that response kind of like we did last time. I'll look for responses in your comments underneath, and I'll do my best to kind of chime in, but you should also chime in to each other's. And point out things about the textbooks that you were interested in, things that maybe I've written about or talked about here or haven't, things that are important to you. Also for next week, I want you to know that we're going to be doing some workshopping. I've got 2 workshop stories, pieces, excerpts, whatever we want to call them, that I will have ready to post hopefully soon, like maybe today. If anybody else wants to share something for workshop, I think we could probably get 3 across. Maybe you think that we can't because we spent a lot of time last week with Emily's, but I think we should be able to get through a few things. But we've got 2 for sure, and that's great. I don't have any textbook reading assignments for next class because I want to start looking at our in-class periods as workshop, workshop, workshop. That's going to be the bulk of what they do. And then when we talk about the text, we do it here. So let's talk about the text. Let's talk about details. In the text, she says that details are the lifeblood of good writing. And not just any details, but concrete details. The details that are grounded in the 5 senses. And when we're talking about details here, it isn't just to have details. It's the type of details we're going to include. And it's concrete, things that we can really see, feel, hear, touch, and taste. Make sure that your readers can really understand where something is. Don't just rely on just visual description. Sometimes it's easy for us to fall back on that. Sometimes it's important for us to make sure that we're more inclusive than that. At the same time, we want to be careful with the details that we show. We don't want to overwhelm our reader. It's a very easy thing to end up just burying our readers in details. There are certain writers, certain very, very famous writers from eras gone by that were paid by the word. I'm looking at you, Charles Dickens. I'm not. He's not here. But Charles Dickens was paid by the word. And so Charles Dickens is brilliant, and I'm not remotely saying he isn't. But when we get to the 3rd page about a character's left earlobe, I need a break. And so it's important for us to not do that to our readers, and we're not being paid by the word, we're not being paid by the anything. So it becomes easier for us to prioritize what matters, and what matters are effective details and not necessarily just copious details. I really like one of the things that LaPlante says here about the types of details, and this phrase that she uses of choose your trees. In the book on 61, she talks about how we've all heard that truism, you can't see the forest for the trees. Well, in riveting fiction, it's the opposite. You won't see the forest until you see this tree, and that tree, and that tree, unless, of course, you focus on the details with great specificity. So this idea that we can't see the forest unless we understand individual trees is a really, really smart idea. And so what she gets to is this great expression that she has in this book, and one that I really live in my own writing, which is to choose your trees. If you're describing a forest, you can't describe every tree. It's not going to work. They're not going to seem disparate enough. There's going to be too many. You're going to be overwhelmed. It's going to be Dickens' earlobe all over again. And what you need to do is make the choice of what you're going to be looking at. And so you choose your trees. You figure out what priorities you need to take when it comes to description. Because if you don't prioritize, you could describe too much. Or maybe you don't describe anything, and that's not going to be helpful for us either. And so the book talks about this idea of starting small. And I think this is a great idea, that we don't end up feeling overwhelmed. We start with small details. It's funny. A lot of young writers that I'll work with will come up with this idea that the more general I am, the easier it's going to be for my readers to relate to what I'm doing. this is especially true in creative nonfiction, but it comes up in fiction too. That if I keep the characters kind of vague, then readers can see who they want. They'll have an easier time putting identities with these characters because I haven't done all that work and thus force them into thinking a certain way. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. When I read a story with a character that isn't really fully constructed or really put into any detail, I don't end up thinking, oh, this character can be anybody. I think this character is no one, that I don't know who this is. The idea is that a reader is going to read it and think, oh, I can put a face to this. But what reality is that I don't have any idea to put any face with it because I don't have enough information and context to do it. So what we end up needing to do is choose small details to make it work. The smaller the detail, honestly, sometimes the better. Maybe I don't want to get too small, but some of the most interesting characters that we encounter are ones that have small, unexpected details that are attached to them. There was a time in one of my composition classes many years ago that I was assigning a personal essay type assignment. And there was a student who was talking in this essay about playground games she used to play with neighborhood kids. And she was describing pretty effectively all the kids in the neighborhood. And then she got to this one kid, and she said, I just don't know what to say about this kid. She's just not an interesting kid. I don't know what to say about her. And I said, well, what was she like? And she's like, oh, nothing. She's a boring, nothing kid. No offense to this kid. She didn't come out well in this conversation. And I asked the student, well, why can't we just cut her out? Why do we need her to be in the story if she's not contributing anything and she's not that interesting? And the student said, well, she's got to be there because, and then she shared some plot element that made this person, this character relevant. And so I said, okay, so we have to have her in there. So you've got to give me something that will make the reader remember her. And then the student said, well, I do remember she kind of had mushroom hair. And I said, what does that mean? Like, well, her hair looked like a mushroom. I still don't know what this means. This was years ago, and I don't know what she meant. But it was awesome. And she put it in the paper, just described very quickly this girl with the mushroom hair. And the members of her peer review group liked it and were engaged by it, and it ended up being a really important part of this paper. You can add small details that make it work. It doesn't work if you just describe the statistics of a person. If you describe a character as being 5'11" with brown hair and weighing about 180 pounds, that doesn't, you don't know anything about that character. I don't know anything about that person. And you're giving me a stat that I can look up online for like an athlete. But other than that, I have no real context or understanding of what's going on. You don't make characters come to life with trite, tired descriptions. You make them come to life by doing something that's unexpected. Your writing needs to stay unexpected. So when we talk about details and descriptions, we go back to 62, and LaPlante gives us some ideas on how we define detail. And I think this is a really good section. And it's right there on 62. I've got it marked, but you might not, so maybe that's not that helpful. But, that's how I can tell, because I have that cool little pencil bracket. Some definitions. We can have details that are specific, limiting or limited, precise, peculiar to or characteristic of something, exclusive, special, concrete, characterized by things or events that can be perceived by the senses, real, actual, referring to a particular, specific, not general or abstract, the reproduction using descriptions embodying the five senses of a place, a person, or a thing. When we talk in here, we often talk very specifically about wanting to use concrete details, and this is why. It's something that is of the senses. We want details that encompass the senses. That makes it a more sensory and rewarding experience for our readers. Abstract. Disassociated from any specific instance, expressing a quality apart from an object. The reverse of a concrete detail, something that is not about a particular person, object, or thing. And then general, emphasizing the general character rather than the specific details of something. Vague or indefinite. She then gives us some really great examples of how this works by giving us some general abstract descriptions of something and then giving it in the specific in literary form. So I like to read these because I want to make sure we hear these out loud because they're really valuable. The general abstract would be in this first example, she was sad. Do we know what she was sad means? I mean, it could mean so many things, right? People get sad. People get sad for a lot of things. I have 2 young children. They get sad a couple times each hour to varying degrees and reasons. So the general is she was sad. Here's the specific, which is not using the phrase she was sad at all. The word sad not in here. She sat in her favorite rocking chair in her room, knitting a gray scarf and weeping into the unfinished woolen stitches. Oh boy, that's so much better, right? You can visualize it. You can see it. It isn't really that detailed. It's not overwhelmingly with detail. It's one sentence, but it comes to life, and it's bringing that abstraction to life. This is one of our jobs as writers, is we take abstractions and we bring it to life. General, abstract. My father hated noise. Okay. The neighbors become accustomed to my father throwing open the windows of our living room and dumping a bucket of cold water on neighborhood children who were playing too loudly near the front porch. So we get the idea that my father hated noise, but then we get this other sense of the father, this lack of an ability to hold his temper, sort of a recklessness, a scariness of this character's use of anger in these moments. It becomes much more real, right? She had a drinking problem. 3 times a week she opened a bottle of white wine, not even chilled, and drank it from a coffee cup or until it was dry. She brought the cup into the bathroom and would continue sipping even as she brushed her teeth. If I hear drinking problem, I don't have a context for that. There are a lot of people that have drinking problems. There's a lot of ways to express somebody's drinking problem. This is giving me a very specific image of it. This is detail. This is image. It's taking the general, it's taking the abstract, it's making it literal. And it doesn't just mean that you overwhelm your reader with lots and lots of specific details. It means you're doing something more calculated than that. And that becomes really, really important. The book gets into all sorts of important things as we go through this, and what we're focusing on. And I would love for you to tell me some of the things in these sections that you were especially drawn to. I wanted to talk about that initial discussion of detail because I think it's really, really important. But I also want to make sure that you have an opportunity to kind of tell me what's working well and what you are most drawn to. So please post some of those ideas below. But I want to go through a little bit more as we go on in this section about the detail stuff. On 66, we talk about on seeing the general in the particular. And the German philosopher Goethe writes, there is a great difference whether the poet seeks the particular for the sake of the general or the general in the sake of the particular. So LaPlante asks, what is he saying? When he's talking about symbols and imagery, he was being a bit cryptic, but she's going to paraphrase it here. There's a big difference between whether I say living in San Francisco is a great experience, and by way of illustrating it, I'm going to tell you something that happened to me on the way to school today. Or, this thing happened to me on the way to school today. I want to tell you about it. I want to tell you about it in great detail. Do you think this has something to do with living in San Francisco? Here's what she's trying to say here. In the first case, she's trying to bolster or prove a generalization. Living in San Francisco is a great experience by using a specific example. In the second case, she wants to see if a general picture can arise from a specific event. But the event comes first, not the generalization. It's the difference between trying to categorize things neatly and trying to observe them as they really are. So what we're kind of getting at here is making sure that we describe things in such a way that the reader understands why they matter, but maybe do we let the image take central stage, or do we let the purpose of the image, the message of it, take center stage? So if we kind of stick with the particular versus the general, if we stick with the general, we have things like living in San Francisco is a really great experience. If we think in terms of this generalization, we automatically begin looking for details and experience that fit within that box. When we talk about a place that we live, some things are great, I hope. Some things are bad, probably. But you can start to talk about the particular, and then you can come up with specific instances of something, in this case living in San Francisco, this example, without coming up with a general conclusion. You can, or you can just let the reader come up with a general conclusion. So the examples on 67 are, I went to the Gay Pride March, which attracted more than 1 million people. Up and down Market Street, all you can see was an ocean of humanity, bright colors, waving signs. This is not a statement that is preceded by San Francisco's great. It's kind of making the reader come to a conclusion as we go through. It's a lot harder to put particulars, as she says, in a plain, nice, neat box. Things keep jumping out, refusing to be easily categorized. This is how writing works. When you start to really get specific, it's hard to let it fit into a generalization. And sometimes we're better off if we don't worry as much about that generalization. If you want to create something with the idea that the reader is going to think about it in one specific way, you might end up getting frustrated when your reader ends up looking at that thing in a different way than you originally intended. So we want to be careful with that as we go through. Metaphor is talked about on 69. Using and abusing it. If you go through the images we've looked at thus far, she says in the textbook, you might notice that there are very few metaphors or comparisons. A lot of writing will have good metaphors, and a lot of writing will not use good metaphors. You could do it either way, right? Consider Chekhov to his brother on the subject of using metaphorical statements, including similes, which is, of course, a metaphor is saying something is something else in order to create an image that will kind of resonate with the reader. So if I said that, this book is a knife, it's a very good book, by the way. I'm not sure Cavalier Clare, you should read this. This book is a knife. You kind of get a sense of what that would mean as a metaphor, right? This book is powerful. It cuts at something. There's a power to it. If I said the book was like a knife, that's a simile. It's similar. It loses a little bit of its power with the inclusion of the word like, but it's probably easier to get across to an audience, maybe a little more quickly. Here's what Chekhov said. Evoke a moonlit night by writing that on the mill dam the glass fragments of a broken bottle flashed like a bright little star, and that the black shadow of a dog or wolf rolled along like a ball. So he's using metaphor, a simile in this case, right? The glass fragments of a broken bottle flashed like a bright little star. The black shadow of a dog or a wolf rolled along like a ball. So there's metaphor similes that are working its way here through here. But I think what's interesting is that this use of simile and metaphor in this example does not take me necessarily out of the description that he's trying to get to. It brings it more to life. A good simile or metaphor is going to really bring a new perspective to the thing that's being described in the first place. It's not going to overwhelm that thing. And it's important for us to keep track of that because it becomes very easy to lose track of that as we go on. So it's a key to us to make sure that we're really paying attention to that. And again, a metaphor is a comparison of two unlike things. You don't want them to be too similar. It's not interesting in that way. What's interesting about a metaphor is when you reach out in an unexpected way and end up talking about something that I didn't expect you to talk about. That's cool. That's interesting. There's similes where the comparison is very explicit on page 70, and a lot of these are coming from poems and great works of fiction. My love is like a red rose, Lord Byron. Clouds like great gray brains, Dennis Johnson. The like is kind of allowing us to really see a clear comparison. A face as broad and as innocent as a cabbage. This is still simile, like or as can be used in that case. In a metaphor, the comparison is implied. So in simile, the comparison is just brought out directly for us. Here, it's implied. These are the dog days of summer, says Shakespeare. If you would have added the like, it would kind of diminish the power of that. So we leave it out in this case, we being Shakespeare. I put myself in good company. What do the sightless windows see, I wonder, when the sun throws passers-by against them? So you can see how this is different for these two different types of things. When you're using metaphor and similes, be careful of the cliche. The cliche is probably the biggest enemy that we've got. If you use language that is too cliche, too familiar, then it's going to undermine what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So avoid things like we've got on the top of 71. She cackled like a hen. She raved like a lunatic. It doesn't mean anything. right? It doesn't resonate anywhere. If you begin a story with this sentence, now don't do it because I just came up with this, and this is pretty rocket. But let's say the first line of your story is, "It was a dark and stormy night." How does that make you feel? Does it bring chills? Can you see, oh my gosh, it's dark and it's stormy? No, it doesn't mean anything. You don't visualize anything out of that, do you? Because all you're hearing are the rote words that we've already heard before. This is cliche at its most obvious. These are, there get to be expressions that don't mean anything to us because we can't see them as anything other than words that are on the page. So she cackled like a hen. I don't hear a hen. I don't see anything. It just feels too familiar. He raved like a lunatic. Again, there's no power in these words because they're not fresh. They're not original. They're not dynamic enough. So we need to avoid the cliche as best we can. And obviously there are idioms that we know. She ran as fast as the wind doesn't really bring anything to mind at this point because of how cliched the idiom is. But there are other things too. If we're talking about how people in all walks of life do this, well, that's cliche too. That's not an expression that really means much. There are pros and cons to each situation. These just aren't expressions that mean anything at this point because they are so cliched. So, 72, she gives us this question: when should you use metaphor? Some beginning writers feel that their imagery isn't truly compelling without metaphor. The reverse is often true. Gratuitous use of metaphor or similes can clutter up a piece of writing, especially if the metaphors are cliched or are otherwise overly familiar. That's because sometimes beginning writers are in such a hurry to say what something is, they fail in saying what it is. Think about that. We're in such a hurry to say what something is like, we don't say what it is. This is one of the most important things to remember when it comes to writing and describing things, is that we end up overwhelming our reader and undermining our main purpose when we rely too much on metaphor. This is not to say that a great metaphor isn't a great thing, because it is. It really, really is. But if we overdo it, then our reader's just not really going to have a lot that they're able to get out of that. And we need to be careful with that. Absolutely, for sure. I also had us read in this section the story by Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried. And I wanted us to read The Things They Carried because it's a story that really emphasizes detail in a way that very few stories do. And with this story, we get this idea of how these characters in this situation are defined by the physical things that they're carrying with us. And so O'Brien gives us in the story such innate detail of objects that it gets a little bit overwhelming. My wife doesn't like this story. I don't want to throw my wife under the bus, but Chapel didn't really like this story. In fact, whenever I tell her that I'm reading it and teaching it, she's like, oh gosh, that story. And I do ask her why. And the reason why is that she said that it just feels like image after image after image that's not really giving us anything except kind of showing off. And I respectfully disagree. We've had this discussion. It's all very respectful. It's fine. Don't worry about us. We're fine. But what's interesting is it does get bogged down, and I think that's entirely the point. That there are times where I'm just getting lists and lists and lists of military items and military objects, and it feels overwhelming as we go through it. But one of the questions that I want to ask you, and you can't answer it to me directly because you're not literally here in the room with me, I think. No, you're not. Is one of the questions the book asks right away is, what are these concrete details doing? Are you on my side, thinking that they are giving us a full understanding of these characters that maybe not even describing the characters in their personal lives would provide? Or is it just so much that it feels like I'm numb to anything? So I guess basically, are you on my side or are you on my wife's side in terms of the way this story is kind of functioning and getting its points across? I'm also curious about the way the story is told. I mean, I know we're reading it mostly for the purpose of looking at detail. But the way he has such a dedication to giving us these very detailed accounts of what these characters are carrying and what they're doing, he structures a story in a weird way, right? We get the key character death happens kind of early on. We're told things pretty early. There's foreshadowing toward it. Then it's kind of linear, but it's kind of not. And I'm curious about how you feel that the structure of this story and the way that they are, the way that he is kind of structuring it affects things. The book has a question on 92 that talks about how telling us Ted Lavender's death so early in the story, how it's working, if it undermines the purpose of suspense in the story, and if it matters. This story could be like kind of an intense war story, and it is, but it's not an intense war story because of like the way plot is presented to us. It's not an intense war story because of the way that suspenseful things are happening. It's intense because of the emotional weight, literally, too, the literal weight also, that's being presented throughout the story. So yeah, think about that. Maybe answer some of those questions that I presented here underneath too, so we can talk a little bit more about this story. And we also read Ron Hansen's Nebraska, which is also fascinating to think about the concrete details that he's using there. So let's make sure we talk about these things if you feel like it. Underneath, chapter 5 begins on 147, and it's one of my favorite things in the book. Is this chapter, the idea of showing and telling. Because you're writers, and some of you are reluctant to take on that mantle of being referred to as a writer, and some of you don't think you've earned it yet. We're getting there. By the end of the semester, you got it. But no matter what writing classes we're in, you very often hear this expression of show, don't tell. Right? We talked about cliches a second ago. This is as cliched as we can get. Show, don't tell. And in essence, in most ways, this is pretty good advice. This is good advice because we should be showing more than we're telling, right? We should be really emphasizing those details, as we've talked about in the previous section. We should be looking at those. But what Case LaPlante makes, and it's a unique one that you don't see talked about that often, and it's quite brilliant, and it's one of the main reasons that I wanted you to read this book with me, is the idea that it is underselling what showing, or it's underselling what telling is. And I think this is great, that you can't just show. If all we're doing is showing, if all we're doing is dramatizing, as we're told in the book, if everything is just about creating like a cinematic perspective, which is what showing is, then there's certain things in a book that would go on for a really, really long time. There's some things that maybe telling can provide. So the book gives us these definitions of showing and telling. And as I said, there's something cinematic about showing, and telling is often referred to as summary, narration. Writers tell to directly communicate or describe to a reader what is happening in a creative work. So as a writer, you can describe the setting. It was a dark and stormy night. They're using my line. You can even describe the characters. She had a face as broad and as innocent as a cabbage. And you can even tell the plot by summarizing it. Okay, so now she's going to get more precise. When a story is dramatized or shown, the reader is presented with concrete evidence of what's happening. What does this include? Think of anything you can witness in the real world. So when we're showing something, when we're dramatizing it, when we're presenting it cinematically, that can include anything we could observe in the real world. Okay? And so that can include words that are spoken, dialogue between characters, actions and reactions among characters, basic objective, and if we're just showing, it's objective, right? Basic objective descriptions of objects or settings that a reader would naturally see. Everything else besides this is narration. So the history, the background information that supplements our knowledge of what's currently happening in the story, explanations or definitions that clarify things, specific thoughts or emotions of the characters, analysis of or commentary on what's happening in the story, fiddling with the clock and moving us around. So showing is really good. It's going to provide a really specific account of what's going on in a given story. But telling is not bad. We can get both of them across. Okay? So the book then proceeds to kind of give us a better understanding of showing and not telling. And how most pieces do plenty of showing and telling. And we need to make sure we get it across. If we just focused on showing, most of our short stories would be intensely long, because we'd be we'd never have any points that we would just gloss over. And not that telling is glossing over, but there are certain points in which the main interest of a story is one scene, and how the characters physically got there from another point is less relevant. And so it's important for us to understand how we can show and tell and kind of keep these things together. And so narration can be really, really valuable. Showing and telling can complement each other. Right? 156. Ideally, these two elements of writing are organically intertwined. That is, what we tell doesn't just echo or repeat what we show. We use the two together to achieve whatever effect we want. When a section of telling can be eliminated without taking away from a creative work's meaning, cut it, by all means, and allow the showing to carry the piece. But the opposite is also true. Sometimes we can tell something more efficiently, elegant, beautifully, or subtly than we could hope to do if dramatizing it, making it appear cinematic. In such cases, we should eliminate the dramatization or scene in favor of the narration. So this doesn't feel, the way she's presenting it, as anything that bold and controversial, but it could be in some circles, because we really get attached in writing classes to this idea that it's all about showing, it's always about showing. Sometimes it's not. Now, don't get carried away with this. I don't want your stories to just feel like detached narration of a thing that happened. We can really get in trouble with that too. You can have a story that is told completely passively from another perspective, and that's not good. So we don't want just things told. I don't want you to tell me that a tree is interesting. I want you to show me what makes that tree interesting. But at the same time, we're not going to show every tree. You're going to choose your trees. And so the other trees you're going to tell me about, I think, in a way. And that's where the showing and telling idea comes into. So really think about the way that showing and telling can work for us. It's a fascinating exercise. And it's a fascinating philosophy, because we really get overly attached to the idea that everything needs to be expressed to us in detail. A lot of things are, but not everything. And so that's what I kind of want you to be thinking about as we move forward. So for this week, give me some feedback and comments too. Tell me stuff that you thought from this book. I asked you to give me some feedback and thoughts on the things they carried O'Brien's story. Share those below. I kind of didn't get into everything that was in the details section, so make some comments on that. I also went over some of the stuff in the show don't tell section, but didn't go over all of it. I don't need to read you this book. You've read it. Now give me some feedback on the stuff that you really thought was interesting. So provide that below. I will be popping in and giving you some feedback on that too. I also want to give you a writing prompt, and I'll do that in another post. There's a reason. All right. Thank you all. I look forward to talking to you and hearing from you